Hello, welcome to American Baker in Germany. I'm Michelle, and today we are making a doll cake. A friend of mine has a little girl who's turning 5, and she has a doll that she really loves, and it's this one right here. So this is Belle, and we are making a Belle doll cake today. I'm going to make her entire skirt out of cake with vanilla cake with chocolate buttercream. I'm so excited about this because I've been wanting to make one for a while now. So this is going to be a really fun tutorial today, and I hope you enjoy it as well. Let's go!
I start out unwrapping my frozen cake layers. I had baked one 8-inch, one 7-inch cake, both of which I split into 2 layers, and one 8-inch sphere cake, which I cut into 3 layers for a total of 7 layers of cake. I stuck down one 8-inch layer onto my cake board with chocolate buttercream, filled it with chocolate buttercream, then another 8-inch layer, buttercream, 7-inch layer, buttercream, 7-inch layer, buttercream, largest layer of the sphere cake, buttercream, middle layer of the sphere cake, buttercream, and finally, the smallest layer of the sphere cake.
Actually, that's just about exactly right. Oh, I thought it might be too tall, but actually that's just about perfect. Glad I made that much cake.
I carved my cake into a more skirt-like form, tapering from the top down to the bottom. I used my steak knife because, being smaller, it's easier to make the round cuts. A large knife would make straight cuts and make it look too square. I debated long and hard how would be best to make the flounces in Belle's dress. I eventually decided to cut slits into the cake that the fondant would rest into and make a natural movement like the flounces. To get them evenly spaced, I used a piece of parchment paper, cut into a circle, and folded into 12 pieces. I pinned it to the top of the cake and used the folds as a guide to cut the lines into the cake. I followed the lines to cut straight slits into the cake at fairly regular intervals. I extended the slits to go all the way up the cake. I frosted the cake with chocolate buttercream, starting out just frosting a good layer over the whole cake. Then, using my small offset spatula, I found the cuts in the cake and made sure they were visible despite the layer of buttercream. Some of them were harder to find than others. After removing the excess buttercream out of the slits, I cleaned up the frosting. This frosting job seriously took the better part of an hour. It was one of the most difficult frosting jobs I've ever done. So if you want to make this cake, set aside a lot of time for the frosting. Then I cleaned up the cake board with a wet rag and chilled the cake for half an hour. While the cake was chilling, I prepared my yellow fondant. I only had a little bit of yellow fondant. So I took it and mixed it with maybe 700 grams of white fondant, That yellow was too pale for Belle's yellow ball gown, so I added a good amount of yellow food coloring to make it the perfect yellow color. Then I set it aside and rolled out a long log of white fondant, rolling it into a strip and trimming one edge to be straight. The piece tore at one point, so I only used the first piece I prepared. Then, using my tapered fondant tool, I textured the bottom of the strip to look like ruffles. And I placed it around the bottom of the cake with the ruffled edge touching the cake board. The strip was just a touch short to go around the entire cake, so I continued to texture the rest of the strip and cut it to size to add it to the ruffles. I took a moment to press it down and make sure it touched the cake board all the way around. Then I rolled out the yellow fondant really big. I kept checking the size to make sure it was large enough to go over the whole cake. I needed at least 16 inches diameter. As soon as it was large enough, I picked it up with my fondant rolling pin and draped it over the cake. I regret to say at this point I accidentally knocked over my tripod and didn't notice that I had turned off the camera when adjusting it, so I have no more footage of my work. All I can do is tell you what I did and show pictures of the results. I smoothed the fondant over the cake and trimmed the bottom just above the cake board to allow the ruffles underneath to show through. I pressed my fingers into the grooves to make sure they could be seen, but allowed some movement to still be in the hem. Then, using my ball tool, I pressed texture into the skirt, making V shapes between the grooves to create the flounces. They went all the way to the hem of the skirt and all the way to the top of the skirt as best as I could. Then I wrapped the naked doll in plastic wrap from the waist down to the toes to protect the cake from the doll and to keep the doll clean. Then I cut a small cut in the cake the length of my knife blade and pressed the doll into the cake. The doll wanted to tilt forward when pressing it into the cake, so at one point I had to reposition it and press more firmly backwards to keep it straight. Then I mixed a little bit of orange into my yellow fondant to make it a deeper yellow, rolled it out really thin, and cut one edge to be straight, and wrapped it around the doll's torso. I trimmed it at the back to meet together, and trimmed off the excess fondant around the hips. Then I cut it to be a V form in the front. There was a small gap around the hips, so I added a thin log of deep yellow fondant to fill it in, smoothing it with my fingers. Then I rolled out a long log of deep yellow fondant and rolled it into a strip, trimmed it to be straight, and folded it back and forth to create the sash, and glued it on the skirt with edible glue, coming up slightly in the grooves. Then I did the same thing on a smaller scale with a light yellow, and wrapped it around Belle's shoulders, beginning and ending in the middle of the bodice. I stuck it on with edible glue, even on the doll's shoulders, to help the sash to stick. Then I stuck on some sugar pearls in silver and gold with edible glue, 3 on the bodice where the sash meets together. Then 1 silver pearl where the sash around the skirt comes up to peaks. This cake was extremely tall. It didn't even fit into my regular cake carrier, so I used a plastic container we usually use for children's clothing, washed it out, turned it upside down, and helped it stay put with a piece of nonstick mat. It made it to its final destination in one piece. I really love how this cake turned out. I tried really hard to make it look like the dress from the Disney animated movie. I love how the flounces turned out. The grooves really helped give them movement and make them look really like real flounces. I love the ruffles peeking out the bottom. The sugar pearls on the bodice give it just a lovely touch. I'm really happy with it, and my friend was in love with how it looked. It was just what they wanted and made her daughter's birthday special.
How was that? Hello, welcome to American Baker and... Why am I holding this up for Kat?
My favorite line is, can I call you sometime? It's all you had to say to take my breath away.
I need a knife. I always need a knife. And I always forget it every single time.